All right, these are our cameras we check out at school, so I'll use that as our example. Here's the white balance control in the back of the camera. We have auto, incandescent, fluorescent, sunlight, flash, cloudy, shade. So all of those have a numeric value. Remember the slide we did 4 slides ago? There's a numeric value, so if you set it on flash, it's going to go to 5500. Set it on cloudy, it's going to go to 8,000. Right? Shade, it's going to go to 10,000. All right, so just know that that's what this does. It basically assigns a color temperature to the sensor and says, don't correct it, don't change it. This is the light source. And sometimes you can get some weird things. Sometimes you can get some cool things. Sometimes it just looks bad. Okay? So be aware. Sorry, I need a little sip of water there. My throat's a little dry today. All right, another thing that's important in the digital darkroom is the histogram. Okay, every camera has one of these. Every application has one of these. I think your phone even has one. Okay, so this is a really important graph, and it gives you a whole bunch of information. Doesn't tell you if the picture's good. Doesn't tell you much about composition. None of that kind of stuff. Doesn't tell you if it's sharp. Doesn't tell you if the depth of field's good or the motion control's good. But it tells you how your exposure is. How many pixels you have of a certain color and what tones are present. Okay? What I'm going to be showing you here is a luminance histogram, which means it's an average of red, green, and blue. Okay? Some of your cameras will have luminance, and then they'll have red, green, and blue, and yellow, magenta, and cyan, and all these different ways of looking at where the light's falling on here. And of course, it's more accurate. But to keep it simple, I wanted just to go with a luminance. So if you took your image, you made it basically black and white, right? This would be a linear description of the tones present. Okay? So up and down, right? How many tones are present? How many are present of a given tone? That's really unimportant. Who cares how many black and gray and dark gray and light gray and middle gray there are? It's the scene. They're all going to be different. Okay? The bottom is where it's important. Right? That bottom axis is where it's important. It's what tones are present. Okay? Over here, I'm going to throw out some numbers. You'll need these for the next class you take with me. Over here is 0. It's black. Over here is 255, and this is white. This scale gives you 256 levels of gray. And how these are distributed on the scale is how your picture is exposed, how light it is, how dark it is. None of them are the same. You can change the location of all of these tones, the tones that are present, by changing the exposure. Making it darker would move everything to the left. Making the picture lighter would move everything to the right. This particular histogram tells me that nothing in the picture is black, because we start about here. And over here, nothing is pure white, because we end about right here. Okay? Sorry about that. So this is telling me that most of my tones in my image are not completely black and not completely white. And whether that's right or not, I need to look at the image. But it lets me know that I have some room. If I want to lighten the image up, I can give it a little bit more exposure without losing any detail. Because the other thing about this is, if you start moving this over too much to the right, and you start shifting all these, and maybe this becomes 255, anything above 255 is gone. You've gotten rid of that detail in the image. Same with on the other side. If it gets too dark, you start losing detail in the shadow area. Okay, that may not be a bad thing. You may want to have large areas of black with no detail. And you want to have large areas with white, right, with no detail. But at least you have a way of viewing it and seeing where these tones reside on that axis that goes from pure black to pure white. Okay. Again, we don't really care about how many pixels are present. We really do care about where they are, which ones, and where they're located. Okay. So a darker image underexposed, bunched up on the left. Brighter image overexposed, bunched up on the right. What we're sort of looking for is something evenly spaced, where we, got some lights, got some darks, got a bunch of stuff in the middle, but there's no perfect histogram. There's no, this is the right histogram. It's maybe the right histogram for that image, but if you change something in the image, it's going to change. Histogram's going to change. Okay. So think about more what happens very close to 0 and very close to 255, and how you treat those edges, whether you want them white or black. So every image is different. The one on the left is kind of a little bit more low-key. There's no white, so you're going to see a lot of information over to the left. The one in the center is going to be more not direct sun, more middle tone, so you're going to see things basically in the middle. And then, of course, the beach scene is very bright, so not a lot of blacks, but a lot on the brighter side. So that histogram is going to be shifted over towards the 255 or the right side to be on the bright side. So all of these are correctly exposed. All of these are good images. Well, compositionally good, I don't want to say that, but they're good images, okay, in terms of histogram, but they're all different. So just be aware of that, right? You want to make sure everything's contained between 0 and 255. Here's where you can just shift it yourself. If you go home tonight and take a photograph, you'll probably end up with something like in the center. Then, give it less exposure. It's going to look more like the one on the left, and more exposure to the one on the right. And you can then confirm that with the histogram, that one is actually getting lighter and one is actually getting darker. So that's just a way to do a test at home with your camera and kind of figure out if, how this thing works and what it looks like when you start losing data in those shadows areas. Because this would be, an example of you start, underexposing, and in these dark shadows right here where we can see detail, it's going to go away. And over here, the overexposure where we have these surfaces where the sun's hitting the rocks, we got great detail here, but this starts going away. And once it's gone, it's gone. It's not recoverable. It's gone. It's history. It's gone. So you got to be careful about overexposing. I think, if you do have a choice and you're not sure what to do, I'd go to the I'd underexpose by a little bit rather than over. Because over, there's a cutoff at 255. That info's gone. And on the blacks, you can move things around and adjust things, and it might cost some quality, but you can move some things around the shadow areas much more successfully than you can in the highlight. So think about that when you're shooting. If you do run into a situation where you're not sure, maybe take a second shot where you're underexposing a little bit, just so you can maintain those highlights. So histogram is to determine exposure in the field. Yes. That's how you look at if it's exposed properly, if you have the right amount of lightness or darkness in the image, and where you want those pixels to fall. We also have an LCD in the back of the camera, and that's a really bad way to judge exposure, because that's dependent on how much light is around you. If any of you ever done any night shooting, have your camera all set up, you'll take a photograph at night, you look at the LCD and you go, wow, that's great. You'll get home and you find it's 2 stops underexposed because it's blackout. And the LCD is emitting light and it looks perfect, but it's not. That's when you want to go to the histogram. Make sure. Okay? So the LCD is really about confirming composition. It's really about making sure people's eyes are open, right? Those sort of things. But really, it's not the way to determine exposure in the field. Okay? There is another way that we can be assisted quickly about exposure in the field, and it's called clipping warnings or blinkies, something like that. When you take a picture and you display it on the LCD, there may be an area where it's blinking red, right? Or something like that, or just blinking. That would mean if that's a highlight area, there's no detail. You're past 255. Some cameras are set up so they have a shadow warning too. So it'll blink in the shadows, and that's usually a blue color. All right? And if it's blinking in the shadows, that means there's no detail there. So there's these blinkies. So if you see those on the back of your camera, it's not broken. You can turn them off. But they're supposed to be helpful when you're shooting. So it gives you a really quick, at a quick glance, you can determine if you're overexposed or underexposed. So sometimes they're annoying. Sometimes they're helpful. You can turn them off or turn them on depending on how you want to set your camera up. Okay, so moving on a little bit with file format. When it comes to the Digital Darkroom, we care about file format. Pretty much all of our cameras will capture JPEG. JPEG's been around for as long as I have, which means it's really old. It was around before Photoshop, before Adobe. It was just one of these image file formats that was very popular and used throughout, the industry as the personal computer was being developed. It stands for Joint Photographers Experts Group. I'm not going to ask that on a test, but you can certainly impress your friends at the next party. It's a compressed file, so it does throw away data. As you save it, it compresses. You can determine how much compression, how much data is thrown away, or how little, right? But it's always compressed. Okay, so that's good and bad news, meaning it's a smaller file when it goes to your card. Open up, it's big, save it, it's smaller. It's good for resources, hard drives and stuff. But if you're actually throwing away data every time you close it, because you're compressing it, eventually you're going to start seeing some of those artifacts. Excuse me. Good news is you can drag it into any browser, and it opens up. It's good for emails, good for web posts. Everything opens up a JPEG. Smaller files it captures, more images per card, faster frame rates with your camera. My Canon 1DX does 15 frames a second, but it has to be on JPEG. It doesn't do RAW because they're smaller files. And again, like I said, you can control the amount of compression and image size it capture, or when you're saving also from Photoshop. So every camera has JPEG as its default and one of its choices about file format when you're shooting. And every application, after you've worked on it, when saving the file or exporting the file, you also have JPEG as an option. TIFF's been around forever too, before Adobe. Tagged image format. It can be compressed, but it doesn't lose anything. So its compression works in a way in which it looks at a pixel, and if all the pixels around it are exactly the same tone, same color, same RGB value, it calls it one pixel. And then it knows when it opens up to make all 5 of those the same color. Okay? So you don't lose anything when you're saving in TIFF, excuse me, and compressing it. They're really big at capture. They're great to use with Photoshop because you can save Photoshop files with layers as TIFF files. So it's honored by the Adobe products as a format that'll work with the application. So it's not a bad archiving format. It's open. It's been around forever. Okay. Some cameras actually can originate in TIFF. Not many, but some can. And you won't find those that often. They're just really, really huge at capture. Basically, the image is 3 times the megapixel count. So you have a 20 megapixel count. It's an 80 megabyte file. So just be aware of how big that file can be. Okay. So this is mostly for saving images out or exporting from Lightroom or Photoshop or some of the other applications. You can save it as a TIFF file. Okay. Don't lose anything. You can save Photoshop with layers or just save the format. PSD is the Photoshop file. Again, it doesn't compress, so you don't lose anything, and you can certainly save it with layers and do everything you'd want to do with a PSD file. Okay, so some people, use the PSD file It's a little bit less now than it used to be, but some people do. Because this is a file based on Photoshop, it isn't available as a camera choice when you're on acquisition, only when you're exporting or when you're saving the file from one of the applications. So RAW file, you've probably seen this. Maybe some of you shoot in RAW. So the RAW file really doesn't stand for anything, but it's the most data you can get from the sensor. So when you're saving a RAW file, what gets saved to the hard drive or the card after you take the photograph is a very accurate description of how much light fell on each pixel when you made that photograph. And then there's also a file that says this pixel is green, this pixel is red, this pixel is yellow, right? Because if you look at a sensor nowadays, there's pixels, but each pixel has a different filter on it. And so they interpolate the color by looking at the color image, by looking at each pixel's color and how much data. So JPEG, RAW, PSD interprets the color. It interprets what the color is. RAW doesn't. RAW basically sends the luminance information and the color information to Photoshop or Lightroom or something. And then the application then interpolates. And it gives you the ability to edit the file at the very, very root of the file. You edit that interpolation. You're responsible for editing at that level, right? Excuse me. So it will show you an image on the back of your camera. It will show you an image in Lightroom or Photoshop, but it doesn't spend a lot of time trying to make it perfect. It just gives you the data and gives you a quick interpolation of it. And it's your job to optimize that file. Okay? So on one hand, you get more data. You get to work at it at an earlier state in the process. You have more control. The bad news is you have more control. And if you don't know how to edit, you can make it look worse than a JPEG. Maybe. Okay? So that's something to be aware of. The other thing you have to be aware of is that every single camera has a unique RAW file. Now, I'm not saying all Nikons and all Canons. I'm saying the Nikon D700 has a different RAW file format than the 750, than the 800, than the 810. They're all different little files that describe what's the makeup of that sensor, what are the colors, and how should I interpret that. So think about that. You have to have a special RAW converter file for every single camera that's manufactured, loaded onto your computer. So when I bring in an image, right, from my Canon, or I bring in an image from my Sony or my Nikon in RAW, the Lightroom or Photoshop knows how to begin that interpolation process. If you don't have that RAW file, it will just complain and it won't open it up. Okay? So it requires you to then continually download the new RAW files as new cameras become available, especially here at school, because we have a lot of different kind of cameras. But if you buy a new camera, then you're going to have to upload the new RAW file so that your application can see the new files. Last semester, I bought the Sony A7R2, and I shot a bunch of demos for one of the class exercises, and right after I got the camera, and I brought it into the computers here in the college, and I plugged the card in, it wouldn't read it. That camera was too new, and there wasn't a RAW file on the computer for that camera. So I had to go and upgrade all the computers in here for with the latest version that had 5 or 6 new cameras that had just came out. So it is a little bit of work on your part to keep things current. And oh, by the way, this is also how Adobe can kind of manipulate you a little bit. I had an old version of Photoshop, and I bought a new Canon camera, and that version of Photoshop wouldn't open those files. So I went online to the Adobe site. I want to download the most current Camera Raw file so I can look at my Canon files. And it turned out that raw file converter wouldn't work on the version of Photoshop I had. So Adobe forced me to upgrade Photoshop before I could download the raw converter and see the pictures on my camera. Because face it, I mean, some of us are running 2 or 3 year old versions of Photoshop and it works fine. You don't have to have the latest and the greatest. But Adobe sure wants you to, because you spend more money that way. So this is a way that they can manipulate you a little bit to make sure you keep your software up to date. So just be aware of that.